At its peak, RadioShack operated more than 8,000 stores across the United States, Mexico, Canada, and multiple European countries. It was, by almost any measure, the dominant consumer electronics retailer in the Western world. By February 2015, it was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange and filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Its entire asset base sold for just over $26 million. That gap between empire and fire sale is the story worth understanding. It started in 1921, when two brothers, Theodore and Milton Deutschmann, opened a single retail and mail-order shop in downtown Boston. The name came from the small wooden structures that housed radio equipment on ships. The Deutschmanns wanted to serve amateur radio operators, hobbyists who built and repaired their own equipment. It was a narrow market, but a loyal one. By 1939, they had issued their first catalog and entered the high-fidelity audio market. By the late 1950s, they had expanded to 9 stores and an extensive mail-order operation. Then, the company nearly went bankrupt. In 1962, Charles Tandy, who ran a leather goods corporation, saw something in the struggling chain that others had missed. He purchased RadioShack for $300,000. What Tandy understood was that the hobbyist market rewarded expertise over selection. He closed the unprofitable mail-order business, eliminated credit purchases, cut the product catalog from 40,000 items down to roughly 2,500, and replaced name-brand merchandise with private label products sourced from lower-cost manufacturers. He replaced large stores with many small ones, what he called little holes in the wall, staffed by people who actually knew electronics. The logic was clean. Identify the 20% of products that drive 80% of sales and build a lean, knowledgeable retail operation around them. It worked. The model created a genuine competitive advantage. Customers came to RadioShack not just to buy components, but to get answers. The staff could explain a circuit, recommend a part, and solve a problem on the spot. No big box competitor could replicate that combination of density, expertise, and private label margin. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the brand grew steadily, and when personal computers arrived in the late 1970s, RadioShack was positioned to move fast. The TRS-80, launched in 1977, became one of the first mass-market home computers. For a brief period, RadioShack was not just a parts store. It was a technology company at the frontier of a new industry. The peak came in 1999. Tandy Corporation operated more than 8,000 RadioShack locations across North America and under the Tandy name across Europe and Australia. The stores were everywhere, in strip malls, shopping centers, and downtown corridors. The brand had cultural weight. If you needed a battery, a cable, a remote control, or a CB radio, RadioShack was the default answer. That ubiquity felt permanent. It felt to many observers at the time like the kind of market position that simply could not be undone. But the structural weakness was already embedded in the peak. Through the 1990s, RadioShack had begun pivoting away from its hobbyist identity toward wireless phones and consumer electronics accessories. The shift made short-term sense. Mobile phones were the fastest-growing consumer product category of the decade. The problem was that this pivot put RadioShack in direct competition with big box retailers like Best Buy and Circuit City, and with dedicated wireless carriers opening their own branded stores. RadioShack's core advantage, knowledgeable staff, curated components, private label margins, did not transfer to a market where customers compared carrier contracts and handset prices. The hobbyist, who had been the brand's foundation, was being quietly shown the door, and no durable replacement customer was being built in their place. The decisions made under pressure compounded the structural problem rather than resolving it. Management attempted multiple repositioning efforts over the following decade, cycling through strategies that emphasized wireless sales, then accessories, then a broader consumer electronics assortment. Each shift required investment in store resets, staff retraining, and inventory changes, costs that eroded margins without establishing a clear identity. The company faced what the source record describes as years of management crises and poor worker relations alongside diminished revenue. 11 consecutive quarterly losses preceded the bankruptcy filing. That is not a sudden collapse. It is a documented, extended deterioration that management was unable to arrest. The losses were not a surprise to analysts watching the company. They were the visible surface of a much deeper erosion that had been building for years. The unraveling had multiple reinforcing causes. Competition from big-box retailers undercut RadioShack on price for the consumer electronics it was trying to sell. Dedicated carrier stores, operated by the major wireless networks, offered a superior experience for wireless customers. And the rise of e-commerce removed the convenience advantage that had made 8,000 small stores a strength rather than a cost burden. A dense, physical footprint that once meant accessibility now meant fixed overhead that revenue could no longer support. The private label model that had generated strong margins in the Tandy era depended on customers who valued expertise and trusted the brand's own products. As RadioShack chased mass-market consumers, that trust eroded without being replaced by price competitiveness or brand prestige. The company was caught between two markets and dominant in neither. In February 2015, RadioShack was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange and filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. In May 2015, General Wireless, a subsidiary of Standard General, purchased the company's assets for $26.2 million. That acquisition did not hold. In March 2017, General Wireless and its subsidiaries also filed for bankruptcy, and RadioShack announced a shift to primarily online operations. The brand subsequently passed to retail e-commerce ventures, operating largely as a website with a network of independently owned franchise locations. In May 2023, the El Salvador-based Unicomer Group acquired control of the worldwide RadioShack business. The name survives, but the empire does not. The people who staffed those 8,000 stores dispersed into a retail industry that was itself contracting. The physical assets, leases, fixtures, inventory were liquidated or absorbed. The brand retained enough recognition to be acquired and reacquired, which is itself a kind of afterlife, though a diminished one. The broader consumer electronics retail sector continued consolidating, with Best Buy emerging as the dominant surviving brick-and-mortar player. A competitor, RadioShack, had failed to differentiate itself from at the critical moment when differentiation still had time to matter. The precise mechanism of RadioShack's collapse is not a failure of vision or a single bad decision. It is the consequence of abandoning a defensible competitive position, expertise-driven, component-focused, hobbyist-oriented, without building an equally defensible replacement. The company traded a narrow market. It dominated for a broad market it could not win. Every subsequent repositioning attempt was a variation on that same error, chasing scale in categories where RadioShack had no structural advantage over better capitalized competitors. The lesson is not that specialization is always correct. It is that when a company dismantles the specific thing that made it hard to compete against, it needs to replace that thing with something equally specific, not simply with a larger addressable market and the hope that size alone would compensate for the loss of a genuine edge. What RadioShack could not answer in the end was a simple question: why here and not somewhere else? For decades, the answer had been obvious. Then it wasn't. And by the time management recognized the question needed answering, 11 quarters of losses had already written the verdict.